Good afternoon, students, and welcome to episode 15A of Mind-Altering Substances in the Ancient World. I'm your host, as usual, Dr. Rob Steffen, and today we are zooming out from our specific look at the ancient Mediterranean to look at the history of alcohol in the big picture. We'll start with its origins in Neolithic China, set sail across the Mediterranean, drink mead in the halls of medieval kings, and consider which bar I'm going to go to after this lecture to have a beer. So, as you follow along, consider some of the similarities and differences in the way that alcohol is perceived and used in these cultures throughout all of history. To start, let's talk a little bit about the science behind the alcohol in beer. The word alcohol, just like algebra, algorithm, and alchemy, comes from the Arabic language. It was termed by the Persian physician and philosopher Muhammad ibn Zachariah al-Razi in the 9th century AD. And he was able to isolate the compound. During that time, it referred to the fine powder created during the distillation process, which was then used for cosmetics and medical purposes. So it's a little weird that even though the process of drinking alcohol goes back 10,000 years or so, the word itself only goes back about 1,000 years and had nothing to do with drinking an intoxicating liquid. Most people who have had a couple alcoholic drinks know its basic effects: mild euphoria, increased sociability, a decrease in anxiety, and perhaps the ability to find one's jokes increasingly hilarious. The more you drink, however, the more negative effects come into play: impaired motor and memory function, a depressed nervous system, and overall stupor or intoxication. That's what we'd call drunkenness. Few people, however, understand the chemistry behind the active ingredient in beer, wine, and liquor. Alcohol is actually a fairly broad term, encompassing a number of different types of organic compounds. That is, compounds centered around the element carbon. In science speak, we'd say that alcohol is an organic compound where a hydrogen and oxygen compound is linked to a carbon atom saturated with hydrogen atoms. So in a sense, when you're having a glass of wine, you might very well think of it as drinking a bunch of little ball and stick compounds like the one you're looking at here. All drinkable alcohol is actually a subversion of this broader category of compound known as ethanol. Ethanol is represented by the chemical formula C2H5OH. Basically 2 carbon atoms attached to 5 hydrogen atoms and 1 hydrogen-oxygen compound. In its pure state, it's clear and flammable and might smell just a little bit. Ethanol is produced through the process of fermentation, a process where the sugar compounds are broken down anaerobically by yeast and bacteria, changing this from a single sugar molecule into 2 ethanol molecules, 2 carbon dioxide and 2 carbon dioxide molecules. So that's the basic process. Find something with sugar, add yeast, and watch the sugar turn into ethanol. But how does this ethanol compound actually make you think you're a better dancer, or more likely to approach the guy or girl at the end of the bar? Once in the bloodstream and in the brain, ethanol compounds bind to 2 different types of receptors, one that inhibits behavior and one that deals with alertness and memory. Once these are blocked, you feel both more relaxed and sociable, but eventually more tired and forgetful. If you're wondering why you're busting out such awesome dance moves if alcohol's a depressant, it's because it also has stimulant qualities. It releases norepinephrine, adrenaline, and cortisol, all of which hype you up. And on top of this, it also causes the release of the neurotransmitter dopamine, which is why we feel like we're having such a good time when we're out for a few drinks. But eventually, once the alcohol crosses the blood-brain barrier, it starts affecting our basic motor functions. And this is why stumbling home from the bar is an actual thing. To summarize, alcohol does what it does because it blocks some receptors, those that inhibit behavior and make you alert, and releases other chemicals, like adrenaline and dopamine. So next time you consider busting out your own awesome dance move at the bar, think about whether you really want to do this or whether it's the norepinephrine talking. Okay, so where does this all start? When we think about places famous for alcohol today, we think of places like Bordeaux in France or Tuscany in Italy, regions of the old world justifiably famous for their high-quality wines. But the origins of wine production and alcohol production in general are actually nowhere near the old heart of the Roman Empire. Instead, we need to travel eastward to China, where a team of archaeologists discovered the earliest evidence for wine at the site of Jiahu in 1995. This site dates back to around 7000 BC, around 9,000 years ago. And there we have evidence for ceramic vessels that contained a variety of alcoholic beverages, rice wine and mead, and most importantly for our purposes, grape wine. These chemical analyses were supplemented by the discovery of grape pits themselves, the actual things on the inside of grapes. And from then, we learned that the earliest version of wine was more like a cocktail, mixed with honey and tree resin to improve both flavor and preservation. Our early evidence for actual straight-up grapes-only wine comes from Georgia. And no, not the southern state with Atlanta, but rather the Eastern European country. Actually, it's almost as far from Italy as, our Georgia is from Italy as well. Anyway, our evidence for wine from Georgia also comes in the form of chemical analyses. And here we think the wine was drank straight and unmixed, much like it is today. The vessels used for this analysis are also of interest. They're massive and bulky, and kind of weirdly, they can't stand upright. They were likely either put on a stand or buried in the ground. And the same vessel, kind of due to its size and weight, it was about 300 liters, was likely used both for fermentation and for storage, and probably even served out of. Well, maybe at least Italy's got the oldest wine production facility. No, not at all. It doesn't have that either. The honor of the world's oldest winery belongs to Armenia. In a cave known as Areni 1, because it's near the town of Areni, the entire wine production facility was found dating back to around 4100 BC, over 6,000 years ago. And that facility contained everything you need to enjoy wine. A wine press, jars for the fermentation process, serving vessels, drinking cups, and I guess you can kind of see like where the Kardashians make more sense now knowing that they come from a long tradition of Armenian party wine culture. The dawn of the Bronze Age brought with it advances in technology, wealth, and socioeconomic stratification. It also brought beer to the ancient Near East and Egypt. Chemical evidence for beer, drawn from the archaeological remains of ceramic vessels, dates back over 5,000 years in Mesopotamia, and these remains are corroborated by the historical record. Depictions of people drinking a beverage, presumably beer, through straws date back equally as far. While this might seem like a shaky suggestion at first, the straws are actually quite important. Because the beer was unfiltered, barley hulls and other debris would have gathered on this liquid surface, so the straws help the drinker bypass the mess and get to the good stuff. Beer was important enough to Sumerian society that it transcended the mortal realm, all the way to that of the gods. The goddess Ninkasi, that Sumerian patron goddess of brewing, had a hymn dedicated to her, which, in addition to glorifying the goddess, actually described the brewing process. It dates all the way back to around 1800 BC, making it the oldest written record of a beer recipe. We also have economic evidence in the form of receipts for beer. But these receipts aren't the same type that you get at the store for purchasing a six-pack of Coors Light. Instead, they're actually more like payslips. Workers were often paid in beer, and here we can see examples of the receipts they were given for the beer rations they received in exchange for their labor. And that link between work and beer was prevalent in Egypt as well. Because coinage had yet to be invented, workers were often paid in bread and beer. And here we have evidence of this occurring for the workers of Giza pyramids and many other instances kind of beyond that. The basic wage would have been about 10 loaves of bread and one full, kind of fairly large, jug of beer per day. Once the beer was brought home, it was drank by men, women, and children, suggesting that the alcohol content would have been lower than most beers today, probably only something like 3 or 4%. Beer in festivals or for funerals, however, could have been much, much stronger. Our evidence for brewing in the Middle Kingdom is especially strong because of the numerous wooden models that show people engaged in the brewing process. And from these, we end up with a pretty good idea of how beer was produced in ancient Egypt. Back in the Mediterranean, we know that wine was always the alcoholic drink of choice, and that's certainly true for ancient Greece. Archaeological evidence suggests that wine was first made in Greece in the late Neolithic and became a pretty big deal in the early Bronze Age, so right around 3000 BC. And this was around the same time that beer was becoming big in Egypt and in the Near East as well. We think that winemaking first began on the islands of Greece, and then eventually spread to the mainland. But the spread didn't stop there. One of the most important aspects of early Greek culture is that it didn't just stay in Greece proper. Starting in the 8th century BC, Greek city-states sent out expeditions to found colonies throughout the Mediterranean. Southern Italy and Sicily became swamped with so many Greek colonies, they started calling it in Latin Magna Graecia, or Greater Greece. And colonies continued along the French Riviera, the Spanish coast, and even up into the Black Sea. And what do you think these colonists were drinking as they set up shop all over the Mediterranean? That's right, wine. So Greek colonization isn't just about politics or economics, it's also integral to the spread of wine throughout the Mediterranean. Now, wine was a pretty big part of Greek society. Greek wine started out a little stronger than our own wine today, but they'd mix that wine with water in order to reduce the alcohol content. And this is one of the ways they differentiated themselves, who mixed it with water, from barbarians, people who drank wine straight. Wine could then be drunk at meals throughout the day. It also played a pretty big role in religion, becoming part of religious rituals to gods like Dionysus, god of the vine, and part of sacrifices intended to either thank the gods or coax something good out of them. Wine was also at the center of some social interactions, most famously the symposium. Symposia were all-male aristocratic drinking parties held in the house of one of the participants. At these parties, the men would go into the androne, literally the man's room, and lay on couches sipping wine, eating snacks, and discussing politics or philosophy. Over the course of the night, as more and more wine was drunk, these parties would become more raucous. Female courtesans were often brought in for musical and sexual entertainment, and the ancient Greeks even had their own drinking game, kotabos, where they'd fling the dregs of their wine at the target in the middle of the room. At the end of the night, the party would often spill out onto the streets, much like happens today when the bars close down at 2 a.m. Westward, across the Adriatic to the Italian peninsula, the Romans had their own form of aristocratic drinking party, the convivium. In large part, this was pretty similar to the symposium, a bunch of rich old men sitting around, yammering on and getting sloshed on vino. In other ways, though, it differed. The convivium was as much about food as it was drink, and elite women and children and even lower-class clients of the host would often be found in attendance. And just like the Greeks, the Romans also mixed their wine with water, diluting it to reduce alcohol content and keep the party going even longer. Perhaps surprisingly, they also added a bunch of other stuff to wine as well. Often they'd add honey to the wine just before drinking it, creating a version of wine they called mulsum. Other times, they'd boil the wine and add spices, sort of like today's mulled wine. And just like today, there were different vintages and varietals of various qualities. The Opimian vintage of Falernian wine, dating to 121 BC, was generally considered the greatest single year and type of wine in the Roman world. And if wine was common in Greece, it was completely ubiquitous in Rome. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner wine would have been served. And in total, it's estimated that each Roman would have drank about 1 liter of wine per day. And just for comparison, an entire bottle of modern wine is only about 3/4 of a liter. And if you weren't cooking at home, which was pretty common considering many of the lower class housing establishments didn't have kitchens, then there were plenty of bars to go to. Recognizable by, wait for it, the giant bar that faced out onto the street, bars were frequent stops for the lower classes. Not only because they often served hot food along with wine, but they also had plenty of gambling and prostitutes, any vice that you could dream up. The rich wouldn't want to be seen in such an establishment, but the poor didn't have a problem going to them. It'd be tempting to think that the rise of Christianity and the decline of classical culture brought with it a fall in the cultural importance of wine. It turns out, however, that wasn't the case at all. Going all the way back to Jesus' Last Supper, wine played an important role in Christian religious ritual, namely the Eucharist, also known as communion, where believers would drink wine which symbolized the blood of Christ, or actually turned into the actual for real blood of Christ, depending on your kind of own set of personal religious beliefs. And the Last Supper wasn't the only time Jesus was all about the wine. Remember when he was out at a party and they ran out of wine? Well, he didn't want the party to die, so he naturally turned a bunch of jars of water into wine. Party on, Jesus. That's all to say that wine remained a big deal well into the Byzantine Empire, the successor empire to Rome in the east. Constantine the Great moved the capital of the Roman Empire to the old town of Byzantium, renamed it Constantinople, very literally the city of Constantine, now called Istanbul, and with him Rome became less about classical culture and more about Christianity, which is one of the defining characteristics of the Byzantine Empire. Anyway, with wine, such a big part of Christian religion, winemaking continued to flourish throughout the Byzantine Empire. And by the 10th and 11th centuries, the stereotype of the chrossopateros, or the wine-drunk monk, was alive and well. Kind of a common stereotype trope within literature and common culture. The city of Constantinople itself became known as the City of Wine, and wine from the region became exported far and wide. Back in the West, Europe was in the Middle Ages, also known as the medieval period. We call it that because it was a rather dark time in between the peaks of the Roman Empire and the European Renaissance. And just like in the Byzantine Empire in the East, most of the West was focused on Christianity. Charlemagne became the Holy Roman Emperor, hearkening back to Roman antiquity in 800 AD, and alcohol was closely tied to religion. Monks became the leaders of the winemaking industry. Vinum theologium, or theological wine, became known as superior to most other productions. And during this time, there wasn't too much export across Europe. But if wine was exported, if it was traded, it was usually the monk-made wine that was sent across Europe. Most other wine was produced locally on a fairly small scale. Monks in Western Europe were also heavily involved in the beer brewing industry. Making beer was a great way to purify water and provide essential nutrients that were often difficult to get during tough economic times. The Weihenstephan Brewery in Bavaria started out as an abbey and has been brewing beer ever since 1040 AD. And just down the road, Weltenberg Abbey started brewing beer all the way back in 1050 AD. Both are still brewing today and are possible to visit if you make your way to southwestern Germany. This process continues to the modern day, and not just in Germany. If you go to Belgium, where the Trappist monks produce what are consistently ranked some of the best beers in the world, you can go ahead and try some of this monk-brewed beer. So, highly recommended. Start making travel plans. Medieval Europe also saw the rise of mead, especially in the royal halls of Northern Europe. And although mead might conjure some image of kind of a thick, frothy beer, it was actually much closer to wine. In fact, mead was a version of wine where honey was added early in the brewing process, in the kind of fermenting process. So all those badass barbarian kings like Beowulf weren't slamming brewhouses. Instead, they were drinking nice little glasses of a wine-type substance. The Middle Ages were also when distillation, the process of making hard liquor, was invented. Scholars believe this first happened in China and then spread west through the Middle East and eventually into Europe. With distillation, you basically boil an impure mixture that has some alcohol in it, and then that turns from a liquid into a vapor. The non-alcoholic parts are kind of removed, and the alcoholic vapor then passes through a cold tube which recondenses it into a liquid, resulting in something that's much purer, clearer, and higher in alcohol content than whatever you started with. Stills, the machinery in which distillation occurred, date back to around the 12th century AD and can be found all the way from China to Italy. Throughout all this time, the general attitude toward alcohol was pretty consistent and accepting. Alcohol was generally considered to be a gift of the gods, and it was meant to be consumed and enjoyed. And this perspective, which had really been more or less the same since ancient Rome, absolutely continued into the Renaissance and early modern period. Drunkenness, of course, was certainly frowned upon, but enjoying a nice glass of wine was no problem at all. And the 17th and 18th centuries start giving us some pretty awesome wines to enjoy. French champagne was invented by the French monk and winemaster Dom Perignon in the latter part of the 17th century. Although he had to deal with fairly frequently the problem of exploding bottles, so the pressure would just burst the entire bottle. By the following century, the red wines of the famous French wine-growing regions like Burgundy and Bordeaux began producing vintages that became world-renowned, some of which are still around today. So what you're looking at are these bottles of wine from 1787. This French wine, known as Claret, came from the chateaus that still produce wine in the modern world. The 1787 vintage of Chateau Lafite is legendary. A single bottle sold for well over $100,000 way back in 1985. And the Chateau Margaux once sold wine by the case to the vinophile Thomas Jefferson. One bottle of their wine, valued at around $500,000, was accidentally broken by a waiter in the 1990s. An insurance company actually had to pay out over $200,000 for that broken bottle, making it the most expensive bottle of wine never sold. America was always more closely associated with beer than wine, though. Way back in the 19th century, most of the breweries in America brewed somewhat bitter English-style ales. But eventually, as more German immigrants entered the country, brewers began to shift towards lager and pilsners, a style of beer made with mild Czech hops. These hops helped preserve the beer longer, and soon those lagers we're kind of most familiar with today came to dominate the market. Eberhard Anheuser bought a struggling brewery way back in the middle of the 19th century, and when his daughter married Adolphus Busch, a brewery supplier, Anheuser-Busch and Budweiser Beer was first created. Side note, Budweiser Beer is named for the town of Budweis in the Czech Republic, and hence the use of Czech hops used in its creation. Alcohol of all sorts began to struggle during the 19th century as the rise of factories and 9-to-5 jobs made standard schedules important. All of a sudden, you couldn't just show up to work whenever you want once the hangover kind of passed you by. Attitudes began to change from Ben Franklin's famous "beer is proof that God loves us and wants to be happy" to something more along the lines of "alcohol is from the devil, destroys workers and families, and probably should be abolished." And this, of course, culminated in the 18th Amendment, Prohibition, passed on January 16, 1919, banning the production, distribution, and consumption of alcohol. This was a major blow to many alcohol manufacturers, although some found their way around it. Wineries, for example, often started producing wine for church use, and breweries often turned towards making soda or root beer. When Prohibition was repealed with the 21st Amendment in 1933, alcohol sales took off once again. Lagers came to dominate the market, and the leading breweries, like Anheuser-Busch, Pabst, and Schlitz, drowned out much of the competition from the smaller kind of what we would call craft breweries. Over time, other large companies like Coors and Miller replaced the original behemoths like Schlitz and Pabst, but it's still these very, very large breweries that come to dominate the sale of beer. And let's just get a sense for how much beer is actually being produced. Way back in 1938, shortly after Prohibition, Anheuser-Busch was producing about 2 million barrels of beer per year. Now each barrel is 31 gallons, and each gallon is 128 ounces. So when you do the math, that comes out to be the equivalent of over 650 million bottles of beer per year. That's way back in 1938. Now, it's not all being bottled, right? A lot of it's just being served in kegs and stuff. But that's still quite a lot for way back then. By the year 2000, Anheuser-Busch was producing 100 million barrels of beer per year, which means that they were producing the equivalent of around 32 billion, with a B, bottles of beer. Now, it wasn't all bottled. That includes kegs and beer sent to bars and things like that. But it's still a lot of beer. Beer consumption reached its peak around 1980 when the average American was drinking around 23 gallons, or 250 bottles, of beer per year. And remember, that average includes everyone, people who drink and people who don't. Since the 1970s, smaller craft breweries have begun to challenge the heavy hitters like Anheuser-Busch, Miller, and Coors. The first craft brewery was created in 1976 out in California by an optical engineer. 2 years later, there were about 40 craft breweries in the United States. By 2012, however, that number had jumped to over 2,000, and as of last year, there was something around 3,800 craft breweries in the United States, accounting for over 10% of all beer sold. The United States wine industry, centered on the California valleys of Napa and Sonoma, also took off since Napa Valley's Chateau Montelena defeated the wineries of France in a blind taste test in 1976. Side note, this contest was known as the Judgment of Paris. Just to bring a little back to the classical world for a second, which references the Trojan prince Paris choosing Aphrodite, goddess of love, as the best of the goddesses. Sorry, Hera and Athena. Thus causing basically the entire dang Trojan War. Anyway, the wine production has been growing ever since, and in 2016, the state of California alone produced over 3 billion bottles of wine. That's all to say that alcohol today seems to have regained its status as a gift from the gods, something to be drank and enjoyed, and make life a little bit more bearable. Today in America, each person consumes around 2.3 gallons of pure ethanol per year, which when you convert that to normal drinks, ends up being around 500 drinks a person per year, around 1.5 per day. Because that number includes both people who drink and people who don't, actual alcohol consumption is even higher. And we can see the massive impact on alcohol monetarily as well. Americans spend over $45 billion with a B dollars on beer and wine each year, a staggering portion of our economy. Beer and wine are still a part of fancy parties today, just like the symposia in ancient Greece and the convivia in ancient Rome. Wine's also a big part of religious ritual. We've got communion in church today, whereas wine was almost part of every religious ritual in the ancient Greek and Roman world. And alcohol is certainly a huge part of daily life in both ancient and modern worlds as well. Romans went to the bar just as much as we did, and both Greeks and Romans had alcohol on their table for almost every meal. And while we may not drink an entire liter a day, it seems safe to conclude that with billions of bottles of beer and wine sold each year, that alcohol today is just as important in our culture as it was in theirs.